You're listening to Always Player One, a solo board gaming podcast.
Hello and welcome to Always Player One. I'm Scruffy Gamer.
And I'm Norm. Okay, so today, guys, we have a very special episode for you. We'll be talking about the print and play game, Rollway Station. We'll also be chatting with the designer, who's here with us. And this episode was inspired by you guys, the listeners, who have asked us to cover more print and play games. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to see us cover more print and play games, then go ahead and let us know.
So, just a quick overview of the game before we start. Rollway Station is a brand new, free-to-play, solo roll and write game inspired by 18xx train games. The game takes place over 15 turns and 4 operating rounds. During the turns, you roll 5 dice and assign 2 to claim a share in one of 3 companies, 1 to bid on a train on behalf of one of those companies, and the remaining 2 to place and upgrade track on the map. Everything is done by writing on a single play sheet. During the operating rounds, you get paid for all your hard work and savvy investment by getting points based on what routes the companies can run with their trains and how many shares you have in each company, with the goal broadly being to get the companies you are most invested in to run the best routes for the most points. There are also a few one-use powers called engineers, which provide various advantages when laying track at the cost of points at the end of the game. After the 4th operating round, the game ends and all points earned in previous rounds are totaled for your final score. That's the overview of the game.
Yeah, I think you pretty much nailed that one. Couldn't have said it better myself. So let's bring on the designer. His name's Kendall Mckenzie. Kendall, how are you?
Hello. Yeah, I'm okay today. Thanks for asking.
I hope I got that overview all right.
Yeah, no, I think that was a perfectly good overview of the game. That should be the description on Board Game Geek.
Nice.
So before we begin, for our listeners who aren't aware of who you are, can we just start by asking you, Kendall, to tell everyone a little bit about yourself, what you do in gaming, what kind of games you enjoy, and how you got into the hobby in the first place?
Yeah, so I kind of had a circuitous route. I got into Dungeons and Dragons about 13 or 14 years ago from a comic that I read, The Order of the Stick, and that kind of started my descent into madness, I suppose you could say. I met a lot of similar-minded people, a couple of friends who I still have to this day, and a few years back, I went to stay with my brother, whose housemate said, "Oh, let's all play this game called Mage Knight." And so my first proper designer board game really was, I'd just been to a concert. I got back about 11 o'clock and we played a 3-player game of Mage Knight up till about 3 or 4 in the morning. And towards the end of it, I genuinely turned to my brother and I said, "Do you want to play this again immediately afterwards?" And yeah, that got me down the board game hole, and I was kind of interested I watched a lot of the Dice Tower and stuff like that early on. I was very much the classic buy a bit of everything, play a bit of everything kind of person. And eventually I've refined my tastes to the point where I like about 3 games, and they're all heavy, dry Euros. Mostly I just like the kind
4 games now, though, right?
4 games now, yeah. Well, mostly I like the really heavy, dry Euro games, tight, competitive, very passive-aggressive games, which is one of the appeals of the 18xx genre, which I'm sure we'll come on to in a bit. But also on the side, I play a lot of miniatures games. I've actually been designing a miniatures game for about 4 or 5 years. It's kind of in development hell, and maybe we'll talk about that as well. But yeah, that's kind of my overview.
Awesome.
Excellent.
Yeah, well, that's really awesome. So with this game specifically, you say you've got a minis game in development hell. How was this one quite a quick development, or was it also a bit of a nightmare to get together?
No, Rollway Station, it actually kind of is a bit of a cliche, but it kind of came to me in a dream. I have a very hyperactive brain when I'm trying to sleep. it's strange. I can be as tired as possible, and then I'll lie down, and suddenly I'm attempting to solve every problem the world has ever had in my brain at like 3 a.m, and it just kind of came to me. And the next morning when I got up, I opened Inkscape. Actually, it's a kind of an art program that I did the score sheet in, and I just in one sitting made the first score sheet and jotted down the first kind of instance of the rules. And those rules have changed very little from where it was at the beginning. Overall, the actual process of designing and testing didn't take that long.
Well, I can already hear designers and would be designers listening to this podcast and shaking their fists in rage at how easy you found the whole process.
Definitely. I mean, I think the main thing is it's the nature of the design. It's a game you can play on your own. It's a game that takes 30 minutes, maybe, depending on how well you know the rules. And I would hope that, while you're designing it, you know the rules well. And it's a game that is very, very easy to tweak, because if there's a component that needs changing, well, there is one component in the entire game, and that's the score sheet. So you can iterate very, very quickly and then retest.
I just want to say right off the bat how much fun I had playing it. Like, I know you've been playing it as well, Norm, and I'd love to know as a developer how much fun it is for you to play, because we'll get into a bit more of the specifics of the game in just a moment. But do you enjoy playing it?
I find it quite interesting. I'm not a huge solo gamer myself. I will play a couple of games solo, but mostly that's because I already like the game. I generally won't play a game solo solely to play it solo, which is kind of, I know, the antithesis of this podcast. But this is one that I did quite enjoy. I enjoyed the puzzle, and I did find it quite fun to play myself, yeah.
And that actually brings up a question I was hoping to ask you. So obviously it is an 18xx inspired game, and you yourself have said that you don't enjoy solo games that much. 18xx games aren't typically solo either. How did you come about designing a solo game based on games that aren't meant to be played solo? When did you realize it was a solo game? Was that how it started, or talk me through that?
Yeah, so it was always a solo game. It was kind of a weird little design exercise that I started doing. You and Scruffy are obviously very big fans of 18xx games, and I've played a couple with you and have had varying amounts of fun. But the stocks and shares is something that's really unique. For people who don't know, 18xx games are heavily economic train games where players buy and sell stocks and shares in different train companies. And I was thinking, so much of the interaction in 18xx, so much of the complexity, I should say, in 18xx comes from the other players. The actual basic rules there's no variance between games in the basic rules. And I thought it would be really interesting to see how you can kind of distill that experience and the kind of controlled chaos of what the other players are doing into some kind of solo experience. And also, I did sort of think there were some good train puns in roll and write games. Like, it's a kind of a rule for roll and write games to have a train, or not a train pun, a pun on roll or dice or whatever. So I figured that there's got to be a couple in there.
I love the names of all the companies in Rollway Station. I think they're really cool.
Yeah, for people who don't know, there's the square rail, there's the circle line, and there's a pentagonal express. Did I get that right, Kendall?
Yeah, that's correct. Mostly because I didn't know what else to do, and I can draw squares and circles and pentagons, so I figured, well, it's a simple icon.
Yeah, it gives it such a kind of streamlined simplicity. I really appreciate it. Like, but you kind of feel like each of them has their own personality in a kind of weird way. I always gravitate towards the circle line because it feels like the shares in that are hardest to get. Because just for people who haven't played it, the way you get the shares in the company is different for each company. So for the square line, you look at the differential between the two dice you send there, and so long as it's higher than the previous share you got with them, then you can take a share in that company. So obviously you want a low differential at first, but as the game goes on, you want a higher differential. that I think is my favorite mechanic. The circle line just needs pairs of numbers, and they have to be different each time. And for the Pentagonal Express, all you need for a share in theirs is a 7 of any combination. And it doesn't matter what the previous shares you have are. So you can see already, just looking at that the companies have their own sort of style and a different approach to how you invest in them, and it makes it exciting from turn one, because you go, wow, I just rolled a double, so I should probably invest in the circle line. Oh, but that would also go well in the square line. Oh, what do I do? It's great.
Really, you find the circle one the most difficult to get? I've always thought the square rail was the most difficult, because there's one requirement for the pentagonal. It needs to be a 7. It could be any dice. There are 2 requirements for the circle, which is it needs to be a pair and it needs to be different, but they can go in any order. In the square line, there are kind of 3. It needs to be the difference, it needs to be different to what you've done before, and it needs to go in a certain order. It needs to increase in the the size of the difference. So I always found the square to be most difficult, but I guess you project onto it your own feelings.
Well, we've got a tiebreaker here. Designer, which is the most difficult company?
Well, I actually, I really like that that's the first mechanic that you brought up in discussing it, because it was also the mechanic that the game was designed around. That was the first thing I came up with. And initially it was actually going to be the way that trains were auctioned, but I only had half an idea for that. And so it kind of got morphed into how you collect the shares. Personally, I think the idea between them is Pentagonal is supposed to be the most simple, straightforward one to get shares in. As in, you always know what you're getting. It's always the same difficulty. The other 2 obviously ramp up the more shares you have. But that's supposed to be balanced out on the map by Pentagonal Express having slightly worse starting positions. And then, obviously, Square's kind of odd, because it's one of those risk-reward type spaces that you can... Technically, any pair of dice will get you the first share in Square Rail. Any 2 dice will get you a share, but any 2 dice might lock you out of several shares down the line. So it's one of those balancing acts of, okay, well, you could actually get the points now early, or you could set yourself up better potentially later down the line.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I see Square as a bit easier than Circle, because for each company you can only have 5 shares in each of the companies, and so that means that you only need to, you've got a leeway of 1 differential on the square. You can kind of skip over one of them. You can have it as a differential of 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and that's all your 5 shares, or you can miss out any one of those numbers and bump every other one up by 1, if that makes sense. Whereas with the circle, you need different pairs each time. And so the chances of rolling the exact pair you need, I mean, you can always ignore 1 pair, obviously, because there are 6. But the chance of you rolling either of the one of the 2 you need on towards the end of the game, or wherever you're trying to get the last share in them, it kind of makes me scared. And I don't want to leave that until right at the end of the game.
Yeah, I guess it goes to what Kendall was just alluding to, where you with the square there's that sort of risk reward, like he was just saying. Sometimes I feel like maybe actually I'm letting myself down, because maybe I could be a little bit more blasé and skip over 1, but it always feels bad to do that. Whereas with the circle, I can get a pair of 1s and then a pair of 6s in the next one, and I don't have to think about it. So I guess it's just, maybe that's just my own hang up. But that's certainly why I think it feels harder anyway. But it's a really interesting design choice, Kendall, because having the pentagonal be the easiest, not just being balanced on the board, because the way you lay the track is through the dice as well. So sometimes it might make sense to lay some early rail for the pentagonal. So then you want early shares of it. And then that kind of, I won't have as many of these to get later on in the game when the other shares are becoming harder to pick up. Do you know what I'm trying to say? There's that kind of push and pull right there, right at the start of the game. Was that like an intentional design choice?
Yeah, so that's definitely the intent there. For Pentagonal being kind of a baseline is definitely there, trying to kind of make you compete between the different share options. So one of my attempts was to basically get you, even after you'd picked the 2 dice you were assigning, was to kind of make you doubt whether that was, you've gone, okay, I'm putting this pair here because I want to put it in circle line. My idea was to try and get you to doubt whether that was a good idea because, okay, well, that's also the optimal move for the first share in square rail, putting a pair down. So immediately you're confronted with a choice of whether to assign that pair to shares, and then immediately whether to actually assign that to square or circle. And similarly, once you get further through the game, the maximum differential you can get on 2 dice is 5, and that's from a 6 and a 1, which again, that could be a pentagonal express share. So it's to force you to not just look out for dice that you get that can be assigned there, but even after you've done that, you still have to make the decision about whether to where to place them.
It does. It does feel like. Sorry, it does feel like everything you roll is it gives you more than one choice most of the time. Like especially towards the start and the middle of the section of the game. Towards the end, you've got the shares you need in some of the companies, so you are just kind of getting the ones you want. But yeah, I'm glad to hear that was intentional because it worked out like that. Both of the playthroughs I did, it worked out like that. That I'd roll the dice and I'd go, right, I definitely want to put this here so this company get the train, or so I get a share in this company. And then now I look at the track and I go, oh, but that won't give me what I need for the track even. So maybe I should get a share in that company instead. And but then that will,
Yeah, and one of the things that adds to that as well, Scruffy, is the fact that the first train, the 2 train, is assigned to a company at the end of your first turn. So even if you lay the track that you want and you purchase the share that you want, immediately, if that train isn't in the company you already have a share in, immediately you're encouraged to cross-invest because that is the best company now because it's the only one with a train and it's the only one that's going to be that is at the moment guaranteed to make you money. So even when everything does go your way, there's still that other dice, which is assigning the train, and that happens. It's the only time in the game it happens immediately. Everything else, it takes a couple of turns to determine who's going to get the train. And I love the fact that the first train is assigned immediately. It immediately incentivizes you to go, okay, this company is better right now. It's a great choice. I really like that.
Just off the back of that, the fact that you only have 4 operating rounds and the way the pacing works makes me so happy when I'm playing the game. So the fact that you don't pay out every turn, but instead you get a few turns leeway to build up. So even though after that first turn, you know that company's got that train, that's not automatically getting you points right now. You still have time to build up a route and maybe even invest in another company because there's going to also be another train available. So you already, before the first time you get paid out, get your points, you already have a distinct choice. Do I double down on this company that's already got that 2 train after turn 1, or do I diversify and give a different company the 3 train? And this is a whole other thing because the way the routes work on the map, it very much encourages that diversifying. But obviously the temptation might be to just double down, and that's perfect in my opinion.
Yeah, so I was actually talking to someone who had very graciously played it, put it on a geek list on Board Game Geek, and actually we exchanged a couple of private messages, and he found that actually he didn't diversify at all, and he managed to get a very, very good score from not diversifying at all, deliberately burning all the shares in one of the companies, which I thought was really interesting. And having re-looked at the map, I can see that there's a lot of options to solely invest in one company. And that kind of wasn't deliberate, but I quite like it as it stands because it sets it up so that you have to be much more calculating. Because if you burn all the shares in one company and a train accidentally goes to that company, then whoops,
It's definitely a push your luck thing, isn't it? Like if you do that, you're relying then on getting the rolls you need to lay the right track for that company and the rolls you need to get the trains in that company, which is 2 variables. But it's nice that the players get that choice, given the ability to do either or. So many games kind of fall down there because they force you to take an all-round approach, or they force you to go all in on one thing. I think in your game, I mean, it's interesting to hear that this person went for one company. When I played both times, I went for 2 companies. So loads of different ways to play it.
Yeah, I always felt like that there's always one company I don't invest in as much, but because of the pacing of the game, when it gets to the 4 and the 5 train, you only have 3 turns to set up a route that can run a 4 train and a 5 train, and without using engineers, you can only go through 1 hex per turn, so there's not enough turns to lay all the track you need. So I tend to find that by the time you get to the 6th, you've done so much sharing of the same rail to work around the pacing of the game that towards the end I always go, well, that company I haven't paid much attention to. I can probably start thinking about connecting them in now, because realistically, I'm not going to be able to use this rail again with the same companies I'm already using. And I think that's a brilliant choice.
Yeah, they only have like 2 exits from their sort of home locations, don't they? Most of them, maybe 3 for I think the square one. Maybe a couple have 3, I don't know. But you can't go over the same bit of track twice. You can't go out of the same exit and just run a different train on the exact same route. So it kind of makes you go, especially when I was playing, I invested in the circle, and I got towards the end of the game, they were running 2 trains really nicely, and I was like, well, let's get them to run a third. And I realized that there's no way they can run because they can't go out on either of these rail routes. They have to either completely start anew on a different section of the board, which has no other existing track, or I have to give this train to the company I've neglected and connect them into that pre-existing route.
And that's exactly what I did in my last playthrough as well. I found that I had two companies that were sharing a lot of the same route, and they just couldn't run a 6 train. There wasn't any way I could realistically do it. So I had to get the Pentagonal Express connected in, and it ended up making more money in the last operating round than the other 2 companies anyway. So yeah.
And I mean, I think that's possibly why when earlier I was talking about it didn't actually take that long to design and get put out, is because 18xx already kind of has all of those things. I inherited a lot of tension and compromise from the core 18xx system. I almost feel like I didn't really design it personally. I kind of translated it, if you get my drift, because there's a lot of mechanics that I lifted directly.
You can definitely see the intertextuality between the 18xx games and yours. It does feel exactly like if someone knows 18xx and you said, oh, it's an 18xx roll and write, that's kind of what would maybe go into your brain, because it does feel like you're doing the sort of route managing you do when you're playing an 18xx game, but there's also the stocks and shares there kind of as well. The only thing that's missing, obviously, is the cutthroat player interaction that most 18xx games have, but you kind of expect to lose that in a solo game, and instead it's just allowing you to focus on that beautiful puzzle in a really nice way.
The selling shares expansion is coming to Kickstarter in 2021.
I mean, even the things that aren't lifted from 18xx, like the route building and the way the trains run and the way the rails work, I can definitely see the inspiration. But even the stuff that isn't, I can still see that you've taken a great deal of care to sort of integrate it in a way that is familiar to 18xx players. For example, the way the trains are put into companies is nothing like an 18xx game. Companies don't have any of their own money. They don't purchase trains. They simply you assign a dice to the train at auction, and 1 or 2 represents one company, 3 to 4 another, and then 5 to 6 a third. So that's obviously nothing like an 18xx, but that's also the round tracker that tracks what turn you're on. And when you get to the end of that, you get to the end of the game, and that feels like 18xx because it's the purchasing of trains that drives an 18xx game forward. So even that, which has a really abstracted piece of rules and is nothing like 18xx, I can see it still has that inspiration. And I was wondering if that was done on purpose or if that was just a coincidence.
That's actually the first time that's occurred to me. Genuinely the first time. A lot of the inspiration for this game actually came from a free print and play from P&P Arcade called Doom Realm. I wasn't a huge fan of it, but I could see that it had some really, really cool core mechanics in it. And one of the things it does is it has a round tracker down the side where you have to write down your dice rolls every turn. and then you assign them, kind of in a similar way to Rollway Station. But the round tracker in that is an additional step where you write your results down. And I had this in the back of my mind when I was designing Rollway Station, that I would like the elegance to come from the restricted components. And in that case, it meant something was going to get filled in once a turn, and it was going to be the round tracker. It just so happened to be the trains. You could also argue that the shares are a round tracker as well, because you will have filled in all 15 boxes at the end. But that came after the trains. The trains was how I determined it would be 15 turns long as well. It just felt right to kind of lay them out in that particular manner, with the 2 slightly shorter than the 6. And yeah.
That's awesome. It's awesome. It feels so organic. It does feel spot on.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I can't believe that was just a coincidence, because like Scruffy was just saying, it feels very true to 18xx, the way the trains push the game. So yeah, well, bravo. You can you should have absolutely said it was on purpose.
It was on purpose.
There we go.
Well, as I always say, nothing in media happens by accident. There we go.
I'll just edit that all down so that the answer to the first question was just you saying it was on purpose. That would be perfect.
100% on purpose.
So there's one thing I did want to ask. One thing that isn't quite true to 18xx is the colours of the hexagons. So you do have yellow hexagons, green and grey, but there are no brown hexagons. And I was just wondering why you've made that choice.
Yeah, so I started with a different score sheet. It's very similarly laid out, but it's a lot rougher and it looks very different. I like to jump in straight away with the visuals, and I do that with everything I design. So I mentioned my minis game earlier. Before any actual rules were on paper or in a Word document, the rules were visible on cards. I'd mocked up cards in Excel. That's just kind of how I roll. So the score sheet initially was very quick, very rough. And I did decide that I wanted to go for a kind of 18xx coloured feel. So in that game, the colour kind of moves from yellow to green to brown. In Rollway Station, it moves from a kind of pale yellow to a dark, vibrant green. And the main reason for that is, after my initial score sheet layout that I was quite happy with, where everything was, how the game was working, I just completely redid all the assets. And I used a template online which shows you, it generates for you colorblind friendly palettes. And it will generate you all sorts of different colorblind friendly palettes. It will generate you ones high contrast. So for example, the square rail, the pentagonal express and the circle line kind of icons, they're all just drop filled straight from a palette generated on there for colors that will contrast with everything else on the sheet. And then the rest was drop filled straight from this palette that was generated for me by a website. And I couldn't get it to generate a pleasing looking one with 3 different colors in it, which is why the hexes only go up to green, and they are more shades of green than normal.
Excellent. Okay, so there's a very practical reason for that. I really like that as well. I think I don't think there's any excuse for games not to be colorblind friendly now, especially when you made it sound as easy as checking on a colorblind palette online. I think
yeah, and I'll
kudos.
before you post this online, I don't have the details to hand, but I'll send Scruffy the link to that, and you can put that in the show notes if you want, because it's a really, really useful resource that I thought was so good that it's out there. And there's other filters and things that you can use, and I would recommend absolutely everyone just filter it through one of those colorblind friendly things, or print it in grayscale, or double check, because you don't know what people are going to be doing with your end result ultimately, especially as a print and play. I mean, I've got quite a fancy printer because I like to make print and plays. Not everyone has a fancy printer. Not everyone is going to want to pay for color ink. So you need to also accommodate not just the people who are colorblind, but the people who don't have as good of a printer.
So it sounds like when you made the game, you had it in mind that it was already going to be a print and play game. So you haven't put this forward to publishers. This is something you put straight online. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm not planning on monetizing kind of any of my designs, at least at the moment. I'd much rather just make them, throw them out there, see what people think of them, and it's a bit of fun. It's free. It's something you can do at home, and it's a hobby for me. And I kind of don't want it to become more than a hobby.
Well, I mean, you've had a lot of interest already, haven't you? How many downloads are you at now?
Yeah, so counting my rulebook downloads across a couple of the websites, so it's plug time. It's available on Board Game Geek, Rollway Station. Search it up, look at the files. There's the rulebook and the full color score sheets with low ink option available. That's on Board Game Geek. I've had about 30 or 40 downloads from there of the rulebook. But then I also put it up on itch.io, which you may or may not be familiar with. It's more of a video game website, but they do physical games as well. And I've had 277 rulebook downloads on there in 18 days. So I'm really, really happy about that. I didn't expect more than 10 or 15 people to ever see this game. So,
well, I think you deserve those numbers because it's a really fantastic game. For a free to play roll and write, it's so thinky. The game really puts you up against the wall and puts you in tough spots. It's really difficult to manage short term and long term goals without having to make compromises in the game. And I think one of the reasons that is so difficult is because the way you have to assign the dice, but also the mitigation is very restrictive. You can only use one engineer of that type once, except for the random ones. But you get a penalty in points for using the random ones more than once. They sort of get more expensive. But yeah, I've often found that I want to use more than one engineer a turn, and I can't, or I want to use the straight engineer or the tight curve engineer more than once, and again I can't, and that doesn't take away from the game. To me, that adds to the enjoyment because it feels so difficult. Scruffy, I don't know, in your playthroughs, did you ever feel like I just wish I could do all of it or use this dice again, or did you ever find yourself in those positions?
Yeah, I literally said that out loud in my last video. Like I was working out and being like, well, this is brilliant. So what I'll do is I'll use this engineer for this, and then I'll use this engineer for this. This is going to be great. Oh no, I can only use one engineer, and it absolutely, because they're like these tantalizing little things that can, when you're kind of got your back up against the wall and you're sat and you're going, it's the end of the turns, the end of the OR this turn. I need to make this route connect up to get all the points I need. I'm going to have to dive in and use the engineers, and they feel like they can do it for you, but they're sort of wonderfully restricted, if that feels right. And like, for example, when you lay the ones that give you specific track, you can only lay them in totally empty hexes. You can't lay them on the important hexes that you need to actually connect up to. So you kind of have to plan with them. So they're wonderful design. Did they? Because I remember I played the sort of first version of the game before it was where it is now, and the engineers were slightly different. How was it like designing the engineers, and how did they change? I can't really remember how they used to be.
The engineers initially didn't exist. They are the thing that has changed the most across the game's kind of trajectory. Initially, I found, after testing it a few times, I found myself going, yeah, this is a pretty good game. I think this is solid. It feels on the level of some of the roll and writes I've played before. Yeah, okay, I'm happy with it. But I feel like I'm not placing quite enough track. And that's actually something that's come up from a couple of people who tested it early. And even now, some people occasionally give the feedback of, wow, it doesn't look like you're going to be able to place a lot of track. So I kind of initially dabbled with rolling 7 dice and doing 2 lots of track laying per turn, but that made it so easy. Way, way, way too easy. And it threw the whole dynamic off. So my compromise was to add these engineers in. And as the game's kind of been refined, they've changed. Initially, they were just the random engineer, which is essentially just roll some extra dice. But after some feedback, I just kind of decided to mix it up a little bit, tweak them, gave them the unifying theme of engineers, because initially they were much more abstract. And ultimately, every time I had an idea that was a positive thing, like, oh, what if you had a one that could lay a fixed track? I thought, okay, but what's the restriction I can place on this? Because, you mention again and again those restrictions. I really like giving the people the restrictions. I really like putting those restrictions in place.
And I really like the fact that you did that because, as I said earlier, when I said the game really puts your back to the wall, that's a weird thing to say about a solo roll and write that takes 30 minutes to play. But right from turn one, you kind of think, right, I'll take this share and I'll lay this track, and now the train isn't going to go to the company I want it to. Or, okay, the train goes to the company I want it to, I get the right share, but now, okay, I need to lay this track here instead of... There's always a compromise, and the way the engineers work with those restrictions just adds to that in such a beautifully frustrating way. The temptation just to re-roll the dice. It's just unbelievable. But yeah, that's definitely a part of the appeal to me. I like the fact that it feels a cut above in difficulty to other roll and write games that I've played, at least from my experience. Is that something you share as well, Scruffy?
Yeah, absolutely. It feels like a lot of roll and writes kind of lean towards the light side, which this is in terms of complexity, but also the light side in terms of puzzliness. And they kind of feel like the choices are a bit kind of finger foody. That's the kind of way it feels in my head. It's kind of casual and relaxed, whereas this, it feels crunchy. It feels hard, and it feels like a lot of the difficult situations you get put in are your own fault for pushing your luck, for being like, well, I'm aiming for that star, not that triangle, which was easy, but now I'm up against it because I've committed to that. The star and triangle being the star being worth more points than the triangle. Yeah, so it kind of feels punishing, but also I think what it boils down to as well is that when you roll the 5 dice, you're presented with, oh, you can do whatever you want, unless you roll really badly, like I did in the past couple of rounds. I was like, I need a 3, no 3s. That's very rare. Usually, you roll the 5 dice and you go, yeah, I can do all this, loads of everything, but you can't do everything you want. It's like you say, you have to make so many compromises. You have to go, well, I either do that or that, which is the most important this turn.
The easy mode expansion coming to Kickstarter in 2021.
Now that I did know about the first one, but that one was definitely a lie.
They're all lies.
I did actually say at one point during my playthrough, what a cruel designer.
Did you? That's rich. That's very rich coming from you.
So, do you think you'll get any more roll and writes made up in the future, Kendall, or are you fully focused? What's your next project you're focused on?
So, there's a couple of things. I mean, as I say, I have the overactive brain. I mostly do a lot of designing in my mind, of weird little ideas and kind of design thoughts more than anything. I didn't really expect Rollway Station to end up as a game that I showed to people. I kind of expected it to be what if I could make an 18xx roll and write solo game? So, if I say anything here, it's not a guarantee of it ever coming true. But I've got a lock-picking game that I'm kind of tweaking that I think might be quite interesting. It was initially envisaged as a kind of multiplayer push-your-luck thing, but I might give it the kind of solo-first treatment that I gave to Rollway Station. I've obviously got my minis game, which has been in development hell for years. That's coming along very slowly. And I've also got a kind of a solo draw cards and write type game, sort of vaguely bubbling in the back of my mind, where you are a witch trying to cast spells, and kind of the suits and values of the cards give you different powers and spells you can cast.
That all sounds really interesting. I remember you mentioning your lockpick game a while ago, and if you bring it out as a solo game, we'll have to have you on again to talk about it, because you've clearly got a flair for solo games, even if you're not as massive a fan of them as me and Norma. You can clearly design them well.
Yeah, and just going back to Rollway Station for a second, obviously we've been comparing it a lot to 18xx games because that's where the initial inspiration came from. But although it feels very similar, it does also feel like it's its own thing. It doesn't. It's obviously not an 18xx game. If someone was to come at this game who's never heard of or played 18xx, you think they'll still have a good time with it?
I'd hope so. Yeah, I think it's one of those things where it's like watching a crossover movie, hopefully, in that if you know the characters in the crossover, you're probably going to have a better time, but there's no extraneous knowledge that's going to actually affect the gameplay itself. And the rulebook is written with the assumption that you know nothing about 18xx. It mentions it very briefly in the intro, and then that's it. It tells you everything you need to know. Hopefully, that's enough for players. The majority of people who've given feedback so far do seem to be train game enthusiasts because they like trains, and here's a train game.
Yeah, it feels like you'd probably be able to learn the rules a lot quicker if you've played 18xx games. We would all be kind of half of the course. You'd go, oh, well, that's how you lay tracks in 18x. It's the same. But I think the rule book is really well written, and the examples in it, especially, are really, really crystal clear. I dived in the rule book once just to double check something. It was all very clearly laid out and really, really simple, really easy to understand.
Yeah, it's a great rulebook. It's only 16 A5 pages, and it's perfectly clear. I think people who are fans of roll and writes and have never played 18xx would still absolutely enjoy this, because if the thing you like about roll and writes is that you can sit down, get the game done in half an hour, and have some really thinky and meaty decisions with the input randomness from the dice, then you're going to get all of that from this and more, because there's a lot to consider on your turn, both long term and short term. That's one thing I absolutely love about Rollway Station is the long term and short term goals that you have to manage. You kind of have to manage. Okay, in 2 turns, I'm going to be operating my trains, and I want to make as much money as I can. If I don't connect here to here at some point, and I have the dice to do this now, then that 6 train at the end of the game won't reach. You won't reach here. Now, do I use these dice that will definitely do it now, or do I maybe do it later because I got the short term goal of the operating round? And that is just, yeah, it manages that push and pull so well for such a short game. It's really well done. So kudos for that.
Thank you. Just sort of thought of something that you mentioned a very, very long time ago. That was the first question. It was kind of, did it start as a solo game? At what point did you realize this was a solo game? And I have a much better answer for you now. I mean, it was always a solo game in my mind, but part of the appeal of making it a solo game, one of the things I like about roll and write games when I do occasionally play them is you have a physical artifact. You've built something up. It's the satisfaction that you get in a good tile laying game, or in any kind of good city building type game or engine building game. There's lots of games where you build something up and you get to see the satisfaction of having it go. And building up a train network is pretty fun. It's a cool, fun idea. When you do it in an 18xx, it's not entirely your train network. It's tied to companies, and it's tied to the possibility that the other players might screw you over. So one of the appeals of making a solo 18xx style game, even if we set aside the fact it's a roll and write and all the other things, is that you get to have that internal satisfaction of, this is a thing I've made. I can look at it and I've built this network up over the course of a game. And I know there are roll and write players specifically who will, even if they have access to a laminator, when I do roll and writes, I always print them and I laminate them and just use dry erase on them. But I know there are people out there who will just print a new sheet every time, and they'll keep their old sheets and see and track their score that way and kind of look back and see, oh, wow, this is how far I've come. And I enjoy that there's that satisfaction there that you wouldn't necessarily get from a multiplayer game.
I agree. I much prefer using pads to dry erase, but I know it comes down to preference. Where do you stand on that one, Scruffy?
Oh yeah, I mean, I've only played this one digitally again on Tabletop Sim using the mod I made, but whenever I do print them out, I always prefer to. I like the impermanence of the thing. I don't like the idea of having the sheet forever. I much prefer just writing on it and then either binning it or whatever. It feels kind of quite nice. It feels like a Buddhist mandala or something. It feels very meditative.
The Buddhism expansion. Sorry.
So, Kendall, you did mention that you print and play games yourself. Obviously, this game is available only as a free print and play or on tabletop sim. If you had to give any advice for people who don't print and play or are curious about it, especially after listening to the episode, where would you say they'd start? And
I mean, something like Rollway Station is a really basic place to start if you're getting into print and play, because you need a printer. That's it. You print the sheet, you write on it. The end of story. What you will find if you get into printing and playing is you slowly accumulate all of these specialized tools for printing and playing things. So I have a corner rounder now that rounds the corners on cards. It's one of the best things I've ever bought. But to take a step back, I would basically say your absolute basic introductory print and play things. You want to get yourself some nicer paper, like 100 GSM is slightly thicker than regular printer paper. Regular printer paper is about 75, 80 GSM, depending on what brand you get. 100 GSM is so much nicer. Tiny difference, but it's that little touch that makes your print and plays nicer. You want to get yourself a laminator and either a guillotine or a good steel ruler and a craft knife. And that's going to be your basic print and play kit. With that, you can print and play card games, you can print and play roll and writes, you can print and play, you can make tiles, you can do quite a lot with just a printer, laminator, craft knife, and some nice paper.
And if I might interject at this point, what sort of price point are we talking? If someone does buy that very entry-level print and play equipment, what would they be looking at spending roughly?
Yeah, like which ones would you cheap out on? Which things would you make sure you get an expensive one, if any?
So I've kind of accumulated a lot of this kit from years of. Obviously, I mentioned I play minis games as well a lot, so some of the tools are transferable there. The biggest improvement in your quality is going to be getting a better printer. If you have a cheap printer, your prints are obviously going to look However, the price you pay to improve your quality is also going to be the biggest if you upgrade your printer. So I would recommend get an entry-level printer, inkjet printer. They come with ink. It's absolutely fine. If you want to spend more money, I personally prefer a laser printer, and I have one myself. But do your own research. Do what you feel is appropriate for your budget. All of the other stuff you can get really cheaply. If you go to Wilko or like a DIY store, if you live not in the UK, my laminator I got for £6. It works perfectly well. The refills are £3 for 25 A4 sheets. Most print and plays, you're going to use 10 maybe of those if it's a big print and play. Your nice paper is about the same price, honestly, as the cheaper paper, so there's no reason not to get it. You can get that stuff off eBay or Amazon. The only thing I would say is make sure you get a decent craft knife. Get one with a replaceable blade, because you're going to be doing a lot of cutting, and you don't want to have to replace the whole thing. So like a Stanley knife or something like that.
Yeah, and in regards to if your intention after listening to this episode is just to print and play Rollway Station, as Kendall's already said, you would just need to print the score sheet and own 8 dice. If you can do that, then you can already make Rollway Station.
So, final thoughts on Rollway Station. Then, is there anything else you wanted to bring up about your game, Kendall? Or
solid 5 out of 10.
Solid 5 out of 10. I think it's pretty clear that both me and Norm had an absolute blast playing the game. I mean, I have to say it's one of my absolute favourite games. I really, really enjoyed it, and I haven't played the variants yet. I'm really looking forward to that. There are some variant play sheets which I haven't tried yet. I'm going to play one. I'm going to print one off and play it as well, not just play it on Tabletop Sim, just for the to see if it feels any different playing it in person. I really love the game.
Yeah, I've played it a bunch. It's actually I was looking at my logged plays, and it's actually my second most played game of this year. I probably should tell the listeners that both myself and Scruffy were involved in the early playtesting, so that adds onto those stats as well. However, in this final version, I have played 5 times, and a couple of those plays are the variants and advanced maps, which are also really, really enjoyable. So, if you're curious about the game at all, you just need to print off a sheet of paper, or it's free on Tabletop Sim. Definitely recommend this one.
And just in case you're not sure if you want to dive in and print it off straight away, or if you don't want to read the rule book, then I've uploaded a video of me doing the playthrough to YouTube, and there's links to that in the description, so you can watch that and get a feel for the game, learn the mechanics that way.
Perfect. Let's go ahead and read through the correspondence that we received from last week's episode. Before I go ahead and read the correspondence, Scruffy, what is the question this episode?
This week's question is, what print and plays would you recommend for us to cover next? And what is your experience with print and plays in general?
Perfect. Okay, so we've had a couple of people message in. The first one was from Steve. Now, Steve emailed us, and the subject of his email was "This war of mine," and then in quotation marks, "not a strategic game." So Steve goes ahead and says, so this was probably overstated for an early take without winning. I guess talking about how we said this war of mine was not strategic. He said he's played the game maybe 4 to 7 times. So that's about 20 to 30 hours playing the game. And he's reached the end twice, and he's won properly once. He says there's lots of tactical play in things like improvements around the house, as well as items and weapon priority. And there's lots of decisions around, like, do you get a good fighter with a hatchet, or do you get a bed and food or a water engine, that sort of kind of thing. And you have to manage your tradable items, etc. He says some aspects are unpredictable, granted, with plentiful chances for bad luck to ruin the game, but good play is also possible and rewarding and adaptive. I guess what he's saying there is that we weren't giving this War of Mine as much credit as we should as a strategic game. What do you think about that, Scruffy?
That's interesting. I think it does have interesting choices, but I don't know how much I'd say that is strategic because of the level of output randomness, where you don't have control over what that input causes. So if I leave my survivor with a hatchet in the doorway, and I pull up, a card that isn't it's not relevant to, like, is it memories, which means that he then has a bad memory or a bad experience, then that would have been worse than if I hadn't left anyone in the doorway there and nobody would have had that experience. So that choice I made, there was no way I could have predicted the levels to which that would have had a good or a bad effect. But maybe I'm just being too harsh on it. To me, that doesn't feel like it's a strategic thing. It feels more like it's a just kind of make a choice and hope. It doesn't feel strategy. It feels, I don't know what the word would be.
Well, if I may, I don't think we're being harsh at all, because I don't think we were saying it's not a strategy game in a bad way. Not all games need to be strategic. It's trying to be more than a strategic game. Is what we were trying to say. I think what we're trying to say is that what it loses in strategy, it gains in story and an emotive, visceral response from the player. And I don't think we were saying that to be harsh. We were just saying that as an analysis of the game. Furthermore, in the examples Steve gave, they're all around improvements and what items you take. Because of the level of randomness, they're more sort of tactical rather than strategic plays. They're what's best for me right now this turn, and you have no way of knowing what's going to happen next turn. So you can't you can't plan that strategy. You might save up resources for improvements and stuff, but that's far less than other games, far less strategy than other games that we've covered on the show. But again,
Yeah, I mean, you might build a bed instead of boarding up the house because it's not cold right now, so we just need a bed. And then at the end of the round, it suddenly gets cold, and then an event makes it even colder, and then another event, causes you to, I don't know if there is one, but if you have a bed, it breaks, and that feels like it's not a strategic thing. It's the game just having random effects, not based on your choice,
Yeah, no, and again, not that we think that that's a bad thing. That's what this War of Mine is attempting to do. But we don't. I wouldn't feel comfortable attaching the word strategy or strategic game to this War of Mine, and not because that it's not a good enough game, but because that's not what the game's trying to do, in my opinion. But he's played it more times than I have, so who am I to say that? Okay, but thank you very much for writing in, Steve.
Before you move on there, maybe after playing that many times, it does become a game of strategy. We've only played a few times, and for us, everything's chaotic and random. Maybe Steve is able to predict a lot better what might happen in the different things and what the different events might cause to happen. In that case, perhaps the game does move away from being a chaotic storytelling device into a more thinky strategic puzzle. It'd be very interesting to hear back from you, Steve, if that's the case, whether you found there was a change from when you first started playing to where you are now. Because I think I used to feel very similarly about Mage Knight, where I'd just be like, well, I don't know what enemies are going to come up, so it's just random, it's just luck what I get. But obviously now, having played it so many times, I know if I get a brown enemy, I need 6 or 7 attack to be sure I can kill it, or whatever, maybe 8.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because when you said 6 or 7, I was like, no, there's a brown enemy, that's an 8.
Yeah, the physical resistance, yeah.
And it just shows you that, the more you do play those kind of games, the more you get. So yeah, you who am I to disagree with you, Steve? You're probably spot on, because you've played it more than us. And if we are incorrect, then feel free to write in and let us know. But thank you very much for writing in. We obviously really appreciate it. We love getting your feedback, so really appreciate that one, Steve. Moving on, we also had someone else get in contact. Now, this guy got in contact under he didn't actually write in via an email or a private message. They actually commented on our Instagram. Now, I would normally not read out comments, but he actually brought up something that I was tempted to bring up in the last episode. So I thought, this is fate. I'm going to bring it up now. So Brian wrote in and said, really enjoyed the episode. I like the thoughtful discussion about Wargame. He then went on to say he hasn't played this War of Mine, but he has a similar once-a-year relationship with Navajo Wars, which is more of an emergent story, but it hits just as hard as this War of Mine. Now, the thing that you brought up there was Navajo Wars. Now, this is a game that I was going to use as one of the examples. We looked at the difference between Euro games and war games and how they handle difficult theme in the last episode. Navajo Wars puts you in control of a tribe of Native Americans during the time that they were being slaughtered. And it's your job to handle them. And this is a GMT style war game. And I just thought it was very interesting, because the only other game that I know set in the Old West is Great Western Trail. And if you look at those two games and what they're trying to do there, the contrast couldn't be more different. And I just thought that Brian commenting that, and the fact that I was thinking about bringing that up anyway, really cements what we were talking about on the last episode. And I wanted to ask you about this as well, Kendall, because I know you listened to the last episode. Where do you stand on the use of themes in board games in the context of dark or problematic themes?
I have a kind of unusual relationship, and I'd say I probably have a more hardcore stance than what a lot of people think is kind of normal. I just straight up won't play any historical war game themed on any war that happened after about 1800. Anything after about 1500 starts to be really uncomfortable. But I could maybe stomach Napoleonics and that sort of thing. Anything World War One, World War Two, completely off the table for me. I don't enjoy that kind of simulation. It makes me very uncomfortable. And I'm the same with video games. I'm the same with kind of all media. I would much prefer to have something that doesn't have that real world baggage, because I accept that people are going to play board games for different reasons. The reason I want to play a board game or a war game or anything is because I want to interact with a complex system. I want to compete with other players. I want to enjoy manipulating the pieces and the mechanics, and I'll go to other media for my thoughtful dissection of kind of the past's atrocities. Ultimately, I don't like that in a 2-player World War II game, the likelihood is someone is going to be playing as the Nazis and someone is going to be trying to have the Nazis win. And I know it's just a game, but I don't feel comfortable 100% with that. I can't quite rationalize it, but yeah, not for me.
I think that's really interesting that you bring up the idea of time in that, and that there's kind of a certain cutoff point for you where it starts to become too real, I guess. Is that, do you think, anything to do with that you can imagine it more because it's more based in the world you know, or is it because there are still real world effects from the specific wars or whatever the theme is presenting that are still present in current society, which or is it something else that puts you off the games and makes it too real?
It's kind of, yeah, it's definitely that the effects are more felt on a more personal level. For example, I mean, we live in Europe. Europe was obviously affected much more directly by things like World War II than, say, the United States in terms of war crimes that were committed here. And I have friends whose grandparents and so on did not survive. And that's way too close to home. You know, no one has grandparents who were killed by the Romans. There aren't Romans anymore. There are still Nazis. That's kind of the difference for me.
I get that. Yeah, I get that completely. If you want to know mine and Scruffy's thoughts on the subject, go ahead and listen to episode 4. We take a deep dive into that, which is why Brian obviously commented on our Instagram.
Cool. Well, thank you guys very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the episode. And don't forget to check out the links in the description if you're interested in playing Rollway Station. Highly recommend it. And if you'd like to see the playthrough that I did or the tabletop sim mod I've made, they're in there too. And you can contact us as always.
Yeah, you can contact us on Instagram. We're at Always Player One Podcast. You can also contact us on Facebook. Links to our Facebook are in the description. You can also email us. We are alwaysplayer1podcast@gmail.com. And the question for this week, just as a reminder, was what is your experience with print-to-play games? And what print-to-play games would you recommend we take a look at next on the podcast? Thank you guys very much for joining us. Thank you, Kendall, for taking your time with us today.
Thanks very much for having me and saying such lovely things about my game.
No problem at all. It was our pleasure. Right, thanks for listening, guys. Until next time. See ya. Thank you for listening. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode of Always Player One. Until then, reach out on Facebook, Instagram, or by email to keep the conversation going.